Quick note before we start. YouTube's been rolling out new algorithms, so if this story reaches you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys stories like this. The cold was not just the weather. It was the steel of the weapon slung across Drake Blackwell's back, pressed hard against his spine. It was the icy, bureaucratic core of the Department of Homeland Security directive that had him scrambling across loose shale 50 miles northeast of the nearest respectable town. This high canyon country, all sharp granite teeth and stunted lodgepole pine, smelled of dry amber and the faint metallic scent of the wind's high-speed erosion. Drake moved fast, a dark blur against the moon-pale scree, chasing a target that had stopped being a target 3 minutes ago. He was the agency's best tracker, tuned to the frequencies of the night, the rustle of a mouse, the subtle thermal shift of a resting deer. But the person he was after, an armed trespasser who had crossed the demarcation line near the National Monument, had simply vanished. There were no broken twigs, no displaced gravel, no residual heat signature, only silence. A silence that settled in the valley floor like heavy, poisonous gas. Drake halted, dropping instantly into a low crouch that was pure instinct. He pressed his knuckles into the cold rock face, drawing a deep breath of the thin, freezing air. The temperature was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill pushed it down to 32. The human part of him, the operative trained in compartmentalization, registered the failure. The other part, the part that responded to the deep, resonant hum of the earth, registered the truth. The target had transitioned. He recognized the move instantly, a kinship he had deliberately buried for years. Someone of his own kind, moving through the matrix of the world without disturbing the weave. The recognition was a shot of pure, undiluted adrenaline mixed with ice water, flooding his system. He had not been hunting a threat. He had been hunting a relative. Drake was a creature of two worlds, tethered to the human one by an iron will and a badge he carried like a necessary anchor. He was what the agency euphemistically termed a special asset, a werewolf who had traded the untamed, bloody savagery of the pack for the sterile, regulated violence of the state. His secret unit existed to ensure isolation, containment, and, failing all else, the total elimination of those who dared to tear the veil separating the comfortable human illusion from the ancient, snarling reality. He chose this path. He chose the steel and the rule of law over the senseless, cyclical rage of the bloodline. His past, the memory of his former pack, their scent thick with wet earth and unbridled fury, was a weapon he wielded against himself. He left them because he was tired of the pointless killing, tired of the raw, brutal ignorance. The service gave him structure, a spine of steel. But that internal steel groaned under the weight of this unnerving coincidence. Kinship on the run. His radio crackled, the sound unnaturally loud in the high-altitude quiet. The voice on the other end, clipped, dry, and utterly devoid of doubt, was the definition of governmental efficiency. Blackwell, shift objectives, priority alpha. We have confirmed multiple incursions, pack activity across 3 sectors in the reserve, dozens of missing persons reports converging over the last 72 hours, extreme trauma, dissections, not mere predation. Drake felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was worse than he feared. His kind were careful. They knew the price of exposure. Confirmed pack, he transmitted, keeping his voice level, masking the internal roar. confirmed. "They've crossed the line, Blackwell. They're doing too much damage too fast. We are authorizing strategic bomber aircraft flyovers starting at 6 o'clock in the morning if the threat is not neutralized." Repeat. The entire expanse will be sterilized. You have until dawn to clean your house. The cold metal of the command was palpable. Sterilized. That meant carpet bombing. The total destruction of everything living in this mountain spine, erasing the evidence and the problem simultaneously. The government was ready to wipe the slate clean with fire. Drake had one chance to prevent the wholesale slaughter of his lineage, even the lineage he had forsaken. He had to find and eliminate the perpetrators before the heavy hand of the Air Force arrived. It was not duty he felt. It was the suffocating cinch of a noose. His inner beast, rigorously disciplined over years of training and drug protocols, began to whine, a low, anxious rumble that resonated with the primal call of the threatened bloodline. He turned toward the reserve boundary, the direction his vanished quarry had gone. The air shifted as he approached the demarcation line, a thick, unnatural heaviness. It was more than the scent of pine and moss. It was a dense overlay of fear and recent copious metallic blood. This was beyond simple hunting. This was a sustained, calculated slaughter, exceeding the limits of even the most aggressive predator. The pack was usually smarter, cleaner. Something was profoundly wrong. He had served the law for years to escape this, and now the law was forcing him back into the heart of the darkness. He took his first step across the line, feeling the weight of the human world recede behind him, replaced by the terrifying, familiar freedom of the hunt. He knew the next few hours would define who and what he truly was. Drake did not travel alone. The agency, always hedging its bets, sent backup. 4 highly specialized men who acted as both support and, in the back of Drake's mind, a contingency plan for his own potential failure or betrayal. They were his leash, and he smelled their collective distrust like the rank, bitter odor of stale motor oil and ozone, though the latter was likely just their sophisticated weaponry. Randall was the sniper, a square-faced man from the deep south whose eyes always seemed to be sighting down a barrel. He kept a respectful, almost clinical distance, 20 feet, never less. Randall viewed Drake as a necessary evil, a sophisticated piece of biological technology. There was no hatred in the man's eyes, just a chilling, pragmatic dismissal of Drake's humanity. Randall's righteous coldness was a defense mechanism. He used distance and judgment to keep the irrational horror of Drake's existence from contaminating his ordered world. Randall carried a heavy rifle with a long suppressor, and every move he made was practiced, quiet, and lethal. Drake knew that if he so much as blinked wrong, Randall would end his path without hesitation, convinced it was the right thing to do for God and country. Doyle, the flamethrower specialist, was a different kind of monster. He was loud, all nervous energy and black humor. His cynicism a thick, protective shell against the sheer unbelievable nature of their assignment. "Gonna be a greasy haul, Blackwell," Doyle had chuckled earlier, gesturing toward the twin tanks of napalm strapped to his rig. "But hey, nothing a little crispy critter action won't fix, right? We'll send the whole kit and caboodle back to hell smelling like a barbecue gone wrong." Doyle smelled of gun grease, stale tobacco, and an underlying, frantic sweat. He represented the human attempt to manage chaos through brute force and incendiary destruction. He joked about cremation because the reality of what they were hunting, and what Drake was, was too terrifying to face sober. Then there was Fremont, the veteran hunter. Fremont carried the deep, unforgiving scar of old wounds. His sister had been eliminated years ago during an uncontrolled outbreak, and he looked at Drake with unvarnished contempt. For Fremont, Drake was not a valuable asset. He was just a more cunning, more dangerous variation of the beast that destroyed his life. Fremont's movements were sharp, precise, like a surgical blade. He moved through the brush with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the physics of a bullet and the anatomy of a large predator. He was the most volatile of the group, ready to turn his hunting rifle on Drake at the slightest provocation. His presence was a constant low-grade static of hostility. Finally, Grant, the communications specialist. Grant was the rationalist, the anchor of protocols and paperwork. He perpetually checked the global positioning system coordinates, fiddling with the communication systems, trying desperately to impose the dry, unyielding logic of a field manual onto a world where laws of nature were shredded by claws and teeth. Grant's short, pragmatic phrases, checking grid 790, maintain sector integrity, were his prayer against the encroaching madness. He looked perpetually strained, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the digital map in his hand and the dense, dark thicket ahead. He tried to control the wildness by charting it, labeling it, and radioing it back to command, ensuring that the operation remained sanitized and quantifiable. Drake was to them a necessary tool, a guide dog that smelled too much like the forest and something too ancient to be fully human. They feared his scent, his preternatural silence, and the coiled power he kept ruthlessly under lock and key. Yet, to find the pack, to navigate the rugged, unmarked terrain where the animals blended perfectly into the night, they had no choice but to follow him. They followed the nose that knew the language of blood. The environment itself rejected the men's presence. Every crunch of their heavy boots, every rustle of their synthetic combat gear, sounded deafeningly loud against the primordial silence of the high-altitude forest. Drake felt the human weight, their backpacks, their weaponry, their doubt, like dragging anchors. He moved ahead, letting the animal senses take over. He was not searching for tracks a human would leave. He was searching for the subtle disruption in the environment, the minute shifts in air density, the almost imperceptible scent trail of adrenaline and musk that his own kind left behind. He was a creature of duality, leading men who represented the strict, unforgiving law into the chaotic heart of his former life. The air grew heavier, thicker, as they moved deeper into the designated exclusion zone. The moon, now low in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows that twisted the pines into gargoyles. Drake glanced back at Randall, who maintained his distance with unnerving precision. He saw the cold, detached gaze of the sniper, and he understood. He was expendable. His life, his mission, his identity, it was all conditional. And as he led the way, stepping over roots that snaked through the damp soil like sleeping pythons, Drake felt the first real pang of dread. It was not the fear of confrontation. It was the chilling certainty that whichever side won this battle, he would be the one who lost the most. The rational man was dissolving, giving way to the hunted. The only truth left was the cold rock beneath his boots and the acrid smell of his comrades' contained hostility. They walked for 3 hours, climbing steadily through groves of ancient fir and navigating treacherous rock-strewn gullies. As the forest floor began to flatten out near a high meadow, Drake stopped, raising a hand. The men behind him froze instantly, their training reflexive. The first sign was the distinct lack of sound. The mountain quiet was usually rich. The incessant hum of insects, the chirping of unseen things, the distant cry of a hawk. Here the silence was unnatural, heavy as lead. It pressed on the ears until they strained to hear something, anything, causing a slight phantom ringing. It was not the quiet of peace. It was the stillness of a kill zone, where every living thing had fled or been consumed. "This is wrong," Drake muttered, the words barely audible. Too quiet, like someone vacuumed the life out. Fremont adjusted his grip on his rifle, his breath steaming faintly in the cold. They cleared the area, Blackwell. Smart predators. Drake shook his head, focusing on the scent stream. This was beyond smart behavior. This felt like total biological evacuation. Then they found the first signs of the chaos. It was not the messy sprawl of a struggle. It was an unnerving display of destructive power mixed with strange calculation. They came across the remnants of a small hunting camp. Everything was ruined, but the pattern was disturbing. The metal camp tables were overturned but not shredded, stacked neatly beside the crushed remains of 3 tents. This was not the chaotic rage of hungry animals. It was calculated vandalism, destruction with a point. Grant, the communications expert, was sweating despite the cold. He pulled out a small digital camera and began documenting the scene, his movements stiff. "Protocols require—" He trailed off, his voice cracking slightly. Drake moved to the fire pit. The heavy cast-iron ring used to contain the fire was twisted, the metal looking like chewed tinfoil. Near it, pressed deep into the earth, were paw prints. Drake shifted his stance, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. The prints were massive, far larger than any typical adult male transformation. They were too deep, too broad, indicating a weight approaching 1,000 pounds, half a ton of muscle and bone capable of crushing rock. It was a mass that defied the known parameters of his kind. "This is not my pack," Drake breathed, the dread now a bitter metallic taste in his mouth. "Not just my pack." Fremont scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just big ones, Blackwell. We knew they were pushing the limits." "No," Drake insisted, pointing to the geometry of the impact. "Look at the compression. The structure. This is not just weight. This is density." They followed the trail of devastation further up a small rise. The air began to feel charged, heavy not just with silence and fear, but with a strange, electrical tang. It was there they found the stone anomaly. Looming over the clearing was a colossal granite boulder, estimated by Fremont's practiced eye to weigh between 6 and 8 tons. It had been the solid, unmoving feature of the landscape for millennia. Now it was rolled 20 feet from its resting place, leaving a deep furrow in the rocky soil. "What in the blue hell did that?" Doyle whispered, his bravado finally dissolving. Even his flippant armor could not deflect this absurdity. The stone was not blasted. It was shoved. The displacement defied physics, requiring a single impossible application of brute, living force. 10 yards from the displaced boulder, 2 jagged arches of rock stood upright, looking like crude, malevolent sculptures. They had been wrenched from the earth, and the exposed roots of the surrounding trees were still dripping sap and clinging to the jagged granite. Something had decided to reshape the immediate topography. "That's not predation," Randall said, forgetting his tactical distance and moving closer to examine the strange arrangement. His voice was low, strained. "That's deliberate construction or destruction, but with intent." Drake felt the cold fear in his blood turn to burning realization. His kin did not do this. They were hunters, not earth movers. This level of power signaled a profound, unnatural evolution, fueled by something terrifyingly intelligent. At the second destroyed campsite, the horror became sensory. The lingering stench was not just blood. Mixed with the sharp coppery smell was something acrid, a scent like ozone immediately following a lightning strike, or the sickly sweet tang of a high-voltage short circuit. It was the smell of dead electricity and pulverized earth. Drake knelt, touching the damp soil, feeling the faint vibration still lingering in the rock. The blood here was fresher, darker, sprayed in violent arcs against the base of a pine. The blood belonged to one of their victims, but the essence in the air, that chemically charged, dead electrical smell, belonged to neither man nor his former kin. It was an emissary of something third, something mechanically, monstrously alive. A terrifying truth crystallized in his mind. His mission parameters were fundamentally flawed. They were not hunting a rogue pack. They were hunting a target that the pack itself was running from. He had been sent by the government to eliminate the fire department, believing they were the arsonists, while the true conflagration was still spreading rapidly. The silence and the monstrous calculated damage confirmed it. The fear in his gut was no longer about getting caught. It was about facing something that transcended the known rules of their horrific existence. The search continued for another hour, the tension among the squad stretching taut as piano wire. Grant continuously tapped his headset, trying to fight through the heavy static that thickened the higher they climbed. Fremont whispered darkly under his breath about having a bad feeling, his hunter instincts screaming alarm. Drake led them toward the distant glimmer of a high-altitude plateau lake, a bowl of black water reflecting the half-moon. The air smelled cleaner here, the noxious electric tang fading slightly, replaced by the scent of cold water and damp moss. And there they were. 3 figures silhouetted against the sheen of the lake's surface. 2 larger, 1 slightly smaller. They were in the intermediate phase of transformation, not fully human, not yet the towering, full-shift predator. They stood on 4 heavy limbs, their forms bulky and powerful, but their posture was oddly passive, watchful rather than aggressive. Drake recognized them instantly. The 2 large ones were the Toll brothers, heavy-set, fierce even in human form. The third was Hayden, younger, faster, known for his keen eyesight. Drake raised his fist, signaling the government squad to halt. He took a hesitant step forward, speaking not in code, but in the low, guttural language of their ancestors, a deep, clicking series of sounds that was closer to bone friction than speech. The Tolls responded, their voices not the expected mindless snarl, but a strained, hoarse articulation of human words overlaid with a deep, chest-rattling rumble. "Blackwell," one of them rasped, surprise warring with exhaustion in his voice. "We knew they'd send someone." "You breached protocol." "Civilian trauma," Drake countered, holding his hands open, palms up. A gesture of truce. He felt the tension of his own team behind him, their weapons leveled, safety catches off. "It wasn't us," Hayden said, stepping slightly forward. His eyes, though slightly enlarged and glowing faintly, were clear, not clouded by the red mist of the kill fever. We were chasing it. We've been cleaning up after it. They talked fast, trying to cram the catastrophic truth into the short, tense window. They spoke of a creature that had emerged from the mountain deeps, an aberration, a beast whose power dwarfed even the oldest among them. A force of nature ripped from the rock itself, seemingly immune to their control and their laws. They explained that they knew the rules of the human world. They knew that if the disruption reached the cities, the entire lineage would be put on the execution list. They had not been predators. They had been frantic shepherds, trying to contain a raging inferno, moving silently and desperately to isolate the creature before the human authorities noticed the smoke. "It's feeding on everything," the second toll brother wheezed. "Man and beast. It needs the life force to sustain the shift. It's too big, Drake. We can't hold it." They were pleading, not with defiance, but with exhausted desperation. They were trying to save their own world by protecting the human one from this overwhelming cannibalistic horror. We knew we had to pull back, but we couldn't just let it run free. Hayden finished, his posture relaxing fractionally, certain that the truth, spoken plainly, would be enough for one of their own. Drake's own inner conflict, already at a breaking point, tore wide open. They were telling the truth. The impossible damage, the electrical scent, the unnatural mass, it was all confirmation. The agency was wrong. The blood feud he had escaped had nothing to do with this terror. Before Drake could process the terrible realization, before he could issue a single command to stand down, the negotiations were shattered by the sound of 3 dry, deafening reports. Crack, crack, crack. The noise echoed violently off the granite cliffs, tearing the very fabric of the night. Doyle Harris, the flamethrower specialist, had disobeyed Drake's implicit order for restraint. Driven by fear and a lifetime of training that dictated shoot first, Doyle had squeezed the trigger of his heavy-duty assault rifle, firing high-velocity, armor-piercing ordnance. The Toll brothers and Hayden dropped simultaneously, heavy, wet sounds echoing off the wet stones. The impact was visceral, final. They had not even finished their explanation. They were simply annihilated, proof positive that for the government squad, the mission objective was never negotiation or assessment. The objective was purely, unequivocally, elimination. The blood that pooled quickly on the damp gravel was dark and viscous, smelling overwhelmingly of ozone and ancient regret. Drake stood over the eliminated figures, the heat of the spent cartridges still stinging the air. His duty to the law, to the human contract, had just been used as a shield for senseless murder. The sound of the gunfire was still rebounding in the canyon, but what he heard most clearly was the awful, sick thud of his loyalty finally collapsing. His team was not here to save anyone. They were here to destroy. And now, knowing the truth, he had to choose between the shattered corpse of his oath and the survival of the kin who had just proven themselves to be the victims, not the villains. He knew in that blinding, horrible instant that he was now hunting with the wrong side. The sound of the fatal shots had done more than end 3 lives. It had sent a seismic tremor through the delicate, terrified balance of the mountains. Drake felt a cold, deep rage, but there was no time for it. Doyle was already reloading, his face pale but set in a mask of manic resolve. Grant frantically tried to raise Central Command to report a hostile engagement, his voice high-pitched and strained. "Blackwell, you need to pull us back now! We're exposed!" Grant yelled, looking wildly around the plateau. "Too late," Drake whispered, his eyes scanning the impossible shadows clinging to the rock face across the lake. The shots had been a beacon. They were no longer the hunters. The shift in momentum was chillingly immediate. The first indication of the pursuer was sonic. A low, subsonic vibration began to rise from the earth, passing through the rock and vibrating up Drake's boots and into his skeleton. It was not a roar or a growl. It was a deep, guttural thrumming, the sound of a truly massive, high-density organism moving at tremendous speed, a sound that bypassed the ear and went straight to the bone marrow. "What is that?" Randall the sniper shifted his weight nervously, his professional calm finally starting to crack. Drake did not answer. He threw himself sideways, tackling Doyle just as a black, blurring mass slammed into the ground where they had been standing a second before. The attack was silent, save for the wet, sickening rip of torn cloth and flesh. Fremont Taylor, the hunter who hated Drake, was lifted from his feet and simply swallowed by the darkness. There was a choked, bubbling cry, impossibly short, ending in a sound like heavy fabric being shredded. Then silence. Fremont's rifle clattered uselessly on the rock. The creature was a hole in the light, absorbing the moon's reflection. Drake caught only fleeting glimpses, a texture like oil-soaked matte black fur. Claws that looked less like natural appendages and more like sharpened structural beams, easily the length of a human forearm. It did not pause to feast. It was hunting purely for annihilation. Its movements were an impossible contradiction. Gargantuan size paired with breathtaking speed. It did not run. It unfolded and refolded itself across the terrain in unnatural, black geometries. Randall, reacting with the desperate speed of a professional, opened fire. 3 precision shots from his suppressed rifle hit the creature, which barely seemed to register the impact. The bullets produced a sound like pebbles striking wet clay, a dull, disappointing thump. "Thermite rounds, Doyle, now!" Drake roared, knowing that conventional ordnance was useless. Doyle, galvanized by Fremont's sudden, visceral elimination, ripped a pair of thermal grenades from his harness. He threw them wide, banking them off the cliff face. The resultant explosions were blindingly hot, briefly illuminating the monstrosity. Drake finally saw the hybrid clearly, and the sight was enough to make his gorge rise. It was not a traditional werewolf. Its muscles were impossibly thick, corded and ridged like reinforced cable. The head was bulbous, heavy-boned, with a thick, short snout. Its eyes were huge, reflecting the thermal light like pools of wet obsidian, and they held not the manic intelligence of a shifter, but the dead, cold focus of a predatory machine. It was a fusion, a ghastly evolutionary leap fueled by excessive, unnatural consumption. It focused entirely on Grant, the smallest and most panicked member of the team. Grant, his communication systems array sparking and crackling, was backing away, stumbling over the heavy equipment. The hybrid moved. The low thrumming intensified, vibrating the ground into a visible shimmer. It was not interested in the men as prey. It was focused on destroying the source of the interference, the link to the outside world. Grant let out a choked sound as the creature closed the distance. Drake watched, paralyzed by the sheer impossible speed, as the massive claw swept out. There was a grinding sound of pulverized ceramic and splintered bone. Grant's radio equipment was crushed into glittering dust, and the man himself was thrown against the cliff wall, where he slumped without a sound, a broken silhouette. The impact was final, brutal, and swift. He was undeniably, irrevocably dead. Doyle started screaming, a high-pitched, thin sound that had nothing to do with tough cynicism. He leveled his heavy flamethrower, but before he could ignite the pilot, the creature disappeared again, folding itself into the black geometry of the canyon shadows, leaving only the sound of Randall's ragged breathing and the residual heavy scent of burnt ceramic and blood. The creature's initial attack had accomplished its goal of eliminating the external link. Drake, reverting instantly to the hyper-awareness of the animal, realized what had happened. This was not a simple beast. It was a hunter that used silence and speed as its primary weapons, one that knew how to eliminate communication and instill panic. His government team was functionally eliminated in less than 60 seconds. He and Doyle were now running on borrowed time, tracked by something that transcended the fear he had known his entire life. He had spent years fighting to contain his own savagery, only to be confronted by a true, unbound terror, a horror that wore the guise of his own kind but was fundamentally alien, utterly consumed by a cold, calculating hunger. The next hour was a blind, desperate scramble. Drake, dragging the near-catatonic Doyle, navigated the jagged, complex geography of the high canyons, using his superior knowledge of the terrain to evade the pursuing hybrid. The low, resonant thrumming of the creature was a constant bass note in the air, always present, always close. They found refuge not through luck, but through deliberate signaling. Deep beneath a massive granite overhang, where the air was cold and smelled of mineral deposits and absolute darkness, the remnants of the pack were waiting. The Elder, a massive scarred wolf form with eyes the color of burnt topaz, whom Drake had known since he was a cub, stepped into the thin light filtering from the cave entrance. He was wounded, his flank matted with drying blood, but his posture was that of command, not defeat. With him were two other pack members, both younger, both exhausted. "You brought the fire breather," the Elder noted, his voice a gravelly rumble. He glanced at Doyle, who huddled, trembling against the cave wall, clutching his useless flamethrower. "He's inert," Drake stated, keeping his tone measured. "Your people were telling the truth, Elder. I saw it. Fremont, Randall, Grant, they were all eliminated. It was not my pack." The Elder, whose name was Abel, lowered his heavy snout, a gesture of weary acknowledgement. "We knew you had traded loyalty for comfort, Drake, but we hoped the old blood would still remember the truth." Abel began to speak, his narrative a slow, agonizing confession delivered in the deep, resonant cadence of their kind. The monster, he confirmed, was indeed one of their own, or what had once been. Generations ago, the creature had been cast out for violating the sacred rule: never take the power for pleasure. The exiled one was meant to perish in isolation, but it had not. It found a way to survive without the structure of the pack, without the rules of the change, Abel explained. It learned to take the essence, pulling the strength out of anything living, man or beast, to sustain its transformation. It stopped being a shifter, Drake. It became a vacuum. The Elder painted a horrific picture of a sustained, agonizing evolution. The creature, in its isolation, had mutated, its form becoming denser, heavier, requiring exponentially more life force to maintain its terrifying new mass and speed. It was not territorial. It was driven solely by an insatiable, consuming hunger, a biological imperative to maintain its impossible state of being. "We tried to hold it," Abel rasped. "We tracked it, isolated the trails, contained the damage. We knew if the human government saw the chaos, they wouldn't distinguish between us and that. We were protecting the human world, Drake, to save our own." The government, Abel continued, had arrived at the worst possible time. Drake's squad, armed and operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a rogue pack, had destabilized their containment efforts. The gunfire, the scent of fresh human fear, and the sheer presence of heavily armed humans had focused the hybrid's attention and driven it from the deep mountain caves into the upper hunting grounds. Your people, with their machines and their bullets, woke it up and pointed it at the soft belly of the world, Abel concluded. The government failed in identifying the threat. They failed in identifying who was trying to stop it. They sent you to eliminate the only ones who knew how to trap it. Drake felt a visceral, sick wave of understanding. His rationalism, his belief in the system, was revealed as a grotesque, deadly farce. He had spent his life serving a machine that was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The pride he had taken in his clean, efficient duty dissolved into something thick and black, like spilled oil. The deaths of Fremont, Randall, and Grant, their blind, protocol-driven hatred, were his responsibility. He looked at Doyle, the trembling flamethrower specialist, who had fired the shots that eliminated the first 3 pack members, and saw only a terrified, broken man who had followed a flawed command. Drake, the system loyalist, stood face to face with Abel, the wild pragmatist. The difference between them had shrunk to nothing. The single terrifying truth was that they were all on the same side now. The side fighting against a ravenous biological anomaly that would eventually consume everything. "It knows we're here," Drake said, the words heavy and final. The shots drew it in. "The only thing that matters now is stopping it before the strategic bomber aircraft arrive." Abel nodded slowly. In the heavy, shadowed silence of the cave, the former government operative and the remnants of the savage pack formed an alliance, driven not by ancient kinship or law, but by the raw, desperate, shared urgency of survival. They would fight together, against the horror they had inadvertently unleashed, and against the firestorm the human world was preparing to send down upon them all. The smell of fear was momentarily replaced by the scent of grudging shared resolve. The alliance was forged in silence and desperation. The plan was simple, brutal, and dependent entirely on the physics of mass and gravity. The surviving pack members, Drake, Doyle, and the 3 remaining kin, would lure the colossal hybrid toward a narrow, unstable ridge of granite. There, its immense, unnatural bulk would be a liability. They moved quickly, the scent of impending rain mixing with the coppery tang of old wounds. The air was charged, expectant. Doyle, his earlier hysteria replaced by a focused, manic resolve, carried his heavy equipment, knowing that thermite was their only chance against the creature's thick hide and dense bone structure. They reached the designated pinch point, a precarious, wind-scoured spine of rock overlooking a sheer drop of nearly 1,000 feet. Drake took point, allowing the initial partial transformation to surge through him, heightening his senses, adding speed and steel to his muscles. He was the bait. The thrumming returned, louder now, vibrating the rock spine itself. The creature appeared at the base of the ridge, scaling the vertical face with effortless, silent grace. It looked less like a living organism and more like a catastrophic rupture in the environment. The moment the creature registered their presence, it accelerated. Randall, the sniper, who had been lagging slightly behind, providing remote overwatch for their retreat, saw the hybrid's charge. He was too far to contribute significantly, but he was close enough to see the sheer, inescapable trajectory of the beast. In that final critical second, Randall chose duty not to the government, but to the mission's goal. He knew the creature had to be stopped. He swung his heavy rifle, calculating the velocity and mass in a fraction of a heartbeat. He fired. The shot was magnificent. The heavy, depleted uranium round found the creature's eye socket, the single, soft point in that terrible armored skull. The hybrid did not cry out, but its movement stalled, momentarily thrown off its trajectory. It roared, a sound that was the violent tectonic grinding of rock. That single agonizing second of confusion, purchased by Randall's life, was enough for Drake to pivot, ducking under the sweeping, broken arm of the beast. Randall, seeing his distraction had worked, ran toward the cliff edge, drawing the creature's subsidiary attention. The hybrid, blinded and enraged, slammed into Randall. There was a faint sound of crushing metal and tearing canvas, and the sniper was gone, sacrificed on the altar of a few precious seconds of opportunity. Doyle moved. He saw the path the creature had taken. With a terrifying cry that was half prayer, half curse, Doyle triggered his thermite packs and threw them directly at the base of the ridge, then slammed his flamethrower against the unstable rock face, activating the main fuel line. He had not thrown the ordnance. He had set a fuse. The detonation was cataclysmic. A blinding bloom of white-hot thermite and pressurized napalm erupted, followed immediately by the dull, massive crack of the granite spine giving way. Doyle did not wait. He drove himself into the inferno, his own body consumed in the desperate hope that the sheer force of the self-immolation would destabilize the slope. The earth trembled violently. The air filled with the choking, metallic sweet stink of burning sulfur and melting rock. The avalanche of granite, earth, and incandescent fire slammed into the hybrid, momentarily burying it beneath tons of rubble. The government squad was eliminated. The 3 remaining pack members and Drake were left standing on the edge of the newly formed chasm, covered in ash, blood, and the metallic dust of the explosion. The earth groaned, and then slowly, impossibly, the creature began to emerge from the rubble, dragging its massive, wounded form free. It was injured, its movement slowed, but it was still overwhelming. This was the final stand. Drake, in full transformation, launched himself at the wounded hybrid, backed by the 3 kin. The fight was pure, elemental violence, teeth against thick hide, claws seeking vulnerable joints. Drake focused his attack, driving his powerful jaws deep into the creature's neck, tasting the strangely mineral-rich blood of the aberration. The pain was immediate, blinding. The hybrid retaliated, driving one of its massive splintered claws through Drake's flank, puncturing him deep. But the united force was too much for the injured monster. With a final, shared effort, the pack and the operative drove the creature to the absolute edge of the precipice. with a tearing sound that signaled the end of its path. The hybrid lost its footing and tumbled, its immense weight dragging it down the sheer 1,000-foot drop. The final sound was a distant, heavy thud that shook the valley floor one last time, followed by absolute silence. Drake collapsed on the wet stone, the scent of his own coppery blood mixing with the dust. They had eliminated the creature, but the victory felt utterly worthless. The silence that followed the final impact was heavy and complete, broken only by the thin, ragged breaths of the survivors. Drake lay on the cold, wet rock, his transformed body slowly beginning the agonizing process of reverting to its human form. The transformation was usually comforting, a necessary return to structure, but tonight it felt like betrayal. Every cell that settled back into place screamed with the raw, deep pain of the hybrid's catastrophic wounds. The long claw that skewered his flank had done irreversible damage. He smelled the gasoline and scorched earth from Doyle's sacrifice, the fresh metallic tang of his own blood, and the fainter mineral scent of the hybrid's strange essence. It was a cocktail of death, proof of a battle that defied any sensible report. Then, faint but undeniable, came the sound of the approaching human world. The low, distant thrumming of rotor blades, and then the crisp static of high-power radio communications. Recon was closing in, searching for confirmation to abort the planned aerial bombardment. They were searching for a victory signal. Drake, though barely conscious, felt the clarity of the moment settle over him, stark and unforgiving. He was in the window of choice. If he reported the truth, that the pack was innocent, that a terrifying hybrid had been destroyed, and that his squad had been eliminated, that report would confirm the existence of the pack, ensuring that when the strategic bomber aircraft were called off, the government would simply dispatch a new, better-equipped team to complete the cleanup of the survivors he knew were the victims. He had to lie. He looked at Abel and the two young survivors, who were retreating into the shadows of the cave entrance, watching him with desperate, expectant eyes. They were exhausted, wounded, and dependent on his next action. They had chosen to save humanity from the monstrosity, and in return, humanity was ready to wipe them out. He reached for his own damaged radio unit. The casing cracked, the antenna bent. The rationalist, the man who had lived by protocol, was dead. What remained was the raw instinct for justice, wrapped in the cold pragmatism of the wolf. With an effort that felt like tearing stone, he activated the radio, ignoring the searing pain in his side. He keyed the transmit button, the hiss of static deafening. He held the mic close, his voice a strained, harsh whisper, laced with the primal distortion of the failing shift. "Control, this is Blackwell, Alpha 729er. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, knowing the listening operators were holding their breath. "Mission objective Alpha is complete. Target eliminated. All hostiles neutralized. Repeat, the zone is clean. Recommend immediate stand-down for aerial assets. Request extraction. One man only." Severe trauma? He used the established code phrase for complete mission success and total elimination of the rogue elements. He had just broken his oath, violated every trust, and condemned himself to the life of an outlaw, all with 5 cold, efficient words. The radio crackled back, the voice of the communications officer relieved and professional. "Affirmative. Alpha 729er. Target destroyed. Casualties accepted. We are green for stand down. Estimated time of arrival extraction bird 45 minutes. Drake let the radio drop. The price of salvation was paid in the currency of his own loyalty. He had ensured the continued existence of his former kin, confirming their innocence through the ultimate act of self-condemnation. The government, relieved to avoid a massive, politically sensitive escalation, believed that Drake, the highly effective asset, had accomplished the impossible, sacrificing his entire squad, including himself, since he only requested extraction for one badly wounded man, to neutralize the entire pack. They would never know that the true enemy was one single monstrous entity, and that the supposed villains were now silently disappearing into the vast shadow of the Rockies. They accepted the clean, simple narrative: mission success, heavy losses, threat neutralized. Drake, lying in the gore-slicked dirt, knew the immense weight of his lie. It saved lives, but it sentenced him. He had become the living ghost in the machine, the successful operative who was about to report in as a dead man. The waves of relief radiating from the government communications proclaimed him a hero, a status that now felt like the coldest, most elaborate punishment. He had chosen the chaos of the true world over the deadly simplicity of the lie, and now he belonged to neither. The extraction bird, a specialized, low-observable military helicopter, was still 20 minutes out. Drake, still partially reverted, managed to drag himself upright against the cold, jagged granite. The 3 survivors of the pack were watching him from the mouth of the cave. The elder, Abel, stepped forward slowly. The process of reshifting was painful for him too. He looked like a weary old warrior, covered in scars and the grit of the fight. He looked at Drake, and there was no triumph in his amber eyes, only a profound, heavy understanding. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that passed between kin who had faced the true darkness. "You have saved us." Drake did not speak. The effort of transmitting the false report had taken every ounce of his remaining strength. He was bleeding heavily, the metallic stench of the blood overpowering the smell of the pine and the ash. The understanding passed between them was not a diplomatic treaty. It was a silent, animal agreement. Drake had paid the ultimate price to guarantee their future. They were indebted to him for life and for their freedom, and he, in turn, was now utterly cut off from the human structures he had served. The 2 younger wolves moved first, melting into the dense brush at the back of the cave, their forms fluid, disappearing into the darkness as if they were never there. They carried the heavy, intoxicating smell of wild freedom and raw, untamed danger. Abel paused, glancing back at the chasm where the hybrid had fallen, then at the sky, where the distant whoop-whoop of the approaching rotor blades grew steadily louder. He looked back at Drake, then, without another word, he turned and followed his kin, becoming one with the night. Drake closed his eyes, drawing a deep, shuddering breath. He inhaled the scent of their going, wet earth, pine sap, and the pure, sharp essence of their unapologetic wildness. It was a scent he had not allowed himself to breathe fully since he enlisted, a fragrance of exhilarating, terrible power. As the physical trauma began its grueling work, he felt the terrible weakness set in. Every muscle was a symphony of aching protest. This was the deep structural failure that came from fighting an anomaly of nature. His breathing was shallow, labored. He was alone now, slumped against the ridge. He knew the protocol. The extraction team would find the remnants of the fight, the demolished equipment, the evidence of the chaos. They would find 4 bodies, the bodies of Fremont, Randall, Doyle, and Grant. They would find the crushed remains of the 3 pack members Drake had eliminated. And they would find Drake Blackwell, the lone survivor, severely wounded, the designated hero who successfully completed his mission. If he stayed, he would be rescued, medically stabilized, and hailed as a survivor of an impossible battle. But he would be living a lie, knowing the truth of the saved pack. Once stabilized, he would be subjected to the inevitable debriefing, the psychological evaluations, and the relentless scrutiny that would eventually expose the subtle, fatal discrepancies in his final radio report. The government would find the absence of the primary target's body, the unusual nature of the demise of his squad, and the evidence of the pack's actual intentions. His lie would unravel, and he would become a pariah and an asset to be liquidated. If he left now before the extraction bird arrived, he would be deemed missing in action, presumed eliminated. He would become a ghost, a non-person. He looked at his hands, watching the thick black fur recede, revealing the pale, scarred skin beneath. He was barely alive, but the choice was clear. The rational man would wait for rescue. The animal, now fully awake and aware of the trap, would flee. He pushed off the rock face, moving with a staggering, uneven gait, not toward the waiting extraction zone, but away from it, deeper into the unmarked wilderness. The roar of the helicopter was growing louder now, a churning beat in the pre-dawn sky. Drake was abandoning his uniform, his identity, and his security, trading it all for the thin promise of untamed survival. He was leaving behind the world that called him a hero and entering the world where he was a fugitive. He had saved 2 worlds by lying, but he had lost his place in both. He was now merely the beginning of a rumor, a bloody shadow retreating into the high country. The first 1 mile was agony. Drake moved like a clockwork toy with broken springs, each step a testament to sheer, bloody-minded refusal to surrender. He utilized every scrap of survival training and every deep, ancient trick of his kind to mask his trail. He moved through water, crossed hard stone, and relied on the occasional gust of wind to scatter the pervasive scent of his own blood. The extraction helicopter circled the peak he had just left, its spotlight sweeping the ground, searching for the one wounded man who was no longer there. He tasted the air of lawlessness, and it was sharp, invigorating and terrifyingly cold. The structured world, the one he had spent so long defending, was gone. He was a rationalist, a man of protocols, who had placed all his faith in the absolute structure of law and order, believing it to be the ultimate bulwark against chaos. Now he was a walking testament to the fact that chaos often wore a badge, and that law was merely a complex, self-serving agreement. The truth he now possessed was a sharp, unrelenting piece of glass embedded in his mind. The order he served was fundamentally based on a lie, and the supposed monsters were closer to the truth than the men who hunted them. His transformation of self-awareness was complete. The rational man had been eliminated in the battle. What was left was a hybrid of instinct and clear, terrible lucidity. He realized that the badge, the uniform, the sophisticated weaponry, all were merely props in a grand deception designed to manage the uncontrollable. He paused near a low, tumbling creek, scooping up handfuls of freezing water, washing the thick, drying blood from his face. He caught his reflection in the dark, moving surface. Gaunt, pale, his eyes too bright, too focused. The scars on his arms, proof of old battles, old shifts, felt new, throbbing with the realization of their senselessness. The echo of the betrayal was a physical ache, a hum behind his ribs. He remembered Randall, cold and deficient, falling to his fate, believing he was protecting the system. He remembered Doyle, consumed by fire, achieving a momentary, desperate heroism. They died believing Drake was leading them toward necessary violence. His lie, born of justice, was founded upon their trusting sacrifice. This guilt was a heavier pack than any he had carried. It was a weight that would never be lifted. He stripped the remnants of his uniform, the synthetic fabric, the heavy boots, the specialized harness, tossing them into the deepest part of a narrow canyon stream. The metal felt dead, the composite armor lifeless and meaningless. He wanted the raw textures of the world, the rough bark of the trees, the sharp, cold bite of the granite, the gritty feel of dirt beneath his feet. He was shedding the skin of the operative, seeking the core of the animal that remained. He was now off the grid, beyond the reach of satellites and communication systems traffic. Yet he felt profoundly, intensely watched. The Department of Homeland Security was professional. They would not simply accept a missing asset. Within days, the initial relief over the mission's success would fade, replaced by the meticulous scrutiny of the command staff. They would analyze the last radio transmission, compare the known casualty list with the confirmed remains, and look for the colossal body of the target that was supposed to have been eliminated. They would find holes, large, unfillable logical holes. The scent of burnt earth and lies would attract them like vultures to carrion. Drake knew the process intimately. He was not just a missing operative. He was a profound, catastrophic security breach. He knew too much about the structure, the protocols, and the true vulnerable nature of their operation. He had not merely fled. He had become a fugitive of the highest order. He had crossed the ultimate line, trading a lifetime of institutional safety for a few moments of desperate, necessary truth. The hunt would begin soon, not a casual search, but a professional, focused pursuit led by the very agency that had trained him. They would use technology, human intelligence, and, ironically, other special assets to find him. Drake looked up at the moon, now sinking toward the western horizon. He no longer saw a celestial clock marking the shift. He saw the cold, impartial eye of a judge. His life was defined by the space between the human world he abandoned and the wild world he saved. He had no pack, no allegiance, and no home. He was a living paradox, heading deeper into the wilderness. Drake spent the next several weeks moving relentlessly west, putting hundreds of miles of unforgiving, uninhabited land between himself and the operations zone. His massive physical trauma healed with the painful, accelerated efficiency of his nature, leaving behind taut, silvery scars and a constant low-grade thrum of awareness. He shed every piece of technology, relying solely on his transformed senses. He ate what the high country provided: deer, elk, and the bitter roots of the mountain scrub. He was living as the pack had lived, but without the collective warmth of their presence. This was the isolation he had once craved when he chose the sterile duty of the agency. But this isolation was different. It was not regulated peace. It was the raw, unending tension of the hunted. His movements became liquid, cautious, utterly animal. He achieved a new form of wildness, Not the uncontrolled savagery he once feared, but a reasoned, measured response to an environment where every rustle of dry leaves signaled doom. The profound, unnatural silence he had first encountered at the killing grounds now became the motif of his life. He found himself perpetually listening for the sound that was not there, waiting for the suppressed footfall, the faint, high-frequency distortion of covert listening equipment. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was an enormous, complex maze, and he was the prize in the center. Sometimes, driven by the need for supplies or simply the desperate, lingering need for connection, he risked approaching the fringe of civilization, tiny, isolated towns clinging to the edges of the national forests. He saw the humans there, their faces drawn, their eyes holding a residual, unsettled fear. He knew that fear. It was the legacy of his lie. The government had publicly announced the successful elimination of the rogue pack, but the nature of the brutality, the sheer scale of the initial disappearances, had left a deep psychological wound. People did not believe the simple narrative. They were afraid of the shadows, afraid of the deep woods that were supposedly clean. Drake realized the profound failure of his choice. He had protected his kin, but by creating a false sense of security, he had merely postponed the inevitable conflict. He had not truly solved the problem. He had only moved it from the immediate present into the ambiguous future, allowing the seed of true terror to settle and germinate in the public consciousness. He learned to fear the rain, which washed away his delicate scent trails, and the high winds which carried his scent too far. He feared the occasional high-altitude military overflight, not because they sought him, but because the cold, distant silhouette of the reconnaissance aircraft was a reminder of the vast, terrifying scope of the power he had defied. He knew they were looking for him. Not aggressively, not yet, but methodically. The agency did not forget. They would not admit publicly that their star asset had defected or that their intelligence had been fundamentally compromised. In their files, Drake Blackwell was either a tragic casualty or a critical error that needed quiet correction. He imagined the debriefings now taking place, the analysts piecing together the anomalies, the lack of the primary target's corpse, the specific type of ordnance used to eliminate the squad, and the glaring inconsistencies in the final report. In the eyes of the system, he had not merely disobeyed. He had performed a hostile takeover of intelligence protocols, choosing the wild over the civilized. He was the double pariah, betrayer of the pack, betrayer of the uniform. He belonged nowhere. One evening, crouched high on a ridge overlooking a vast rolling valley bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a distant town, Drake felt a distinct shift in the air. It was not the smell of a bear or a coyote. It was the faint, processed scent of synthetic fabric, refined metal, and human focus. A familiar, acrid smell of high-level government tracking. The hunt had arrived. He did not panic. He inhaled deeply, recognizing the subtle complexities of the scent trail. It was human, but trained, disciplined, moving with the same unnatural silence he himself now employed. They had sent a specialized team, a replacement for the traitor. Drake turned his back on the yellow, comforting glow of civilization. He dropped silently onto four limbs, allowing the deep, quiet power of the transformation to surge through him. His senses sharpened, locking onto the faintest vibration in the earth. His life was no longer about duty or honor. It was about evasion and survival. He was the ghost of a military experiment, the living proof of a high-altitude massacre, and the last remaining witness to a monstrous truth. His fate was to remain on the edge of the clearing, perpetually hunted, forever isolated, caught in the endless, excruciating horror of having chosen the lesser of two evils. He was the werewolf on the run, and the night was immense, unforgiving, and entirely his.